Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. We are in contest prep season. Shows are happening. You hit your show, you're excited, post-show, let's bring up those weak body parts. But hold on, there's things to consider, and there's mistakes that are getting made in this post-show phase regarding training. So today, Luke and I, we are going to address post-show training mistakes to stop making, to where you can make this transition in your off-season be as productive as possible for your season.
Yeah.
Training has just a soft spot in your heart, Luke, right? So,
oh man, it's a special place for me. We've had Darren in town the last couple of weeks. I've been doing some like sessions with him, and it's been a lot of fun just because it's like that in-person side is I'll never, even though I don't do it, I like when I get the chance to do it, you know, it's a lot of fun. But yeah, I think, look, my brain's been so post-show, like been rebuilding the post-show module, and there's a lot to take in regards to how to set up training post-show. And we kind of went through and, you know, updated and rebuilt the progression model that's in there for you guys. So I'm pretty excited for you guys to see all that. But I think a lot of places where people make mistakes is in the assessment piece, like immediately post-show, of like, where is this athlete? And then what cards on the table do I have for training when we go into mapping out training post-show? Because in reality, like post-show is kind of a reaction to kind of how the prep went, and how the prep went and how easy or how hard that was tells you a lot about what you're capable of doing on the training side as you transition into post-show. And I think a lot of that starts with that initial assessment of, you know, questions that I would be asking was, how hard was this prep? How fast of a rate of loss did I have to run? And how hard did I have to dig this athlete? Where was the training volume leading into peak week? And then why did we lose or why did we win on stage? And how do I progress this athlete into that next level of competition? As like probably three of my core questions as a part of the analysis. Now each athlete will have more depending on injury profiles and things. But to me, I think that's where you start. I don't think you can do anything and discuss training at all without even having that initial screening process. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree. Yes, to see, you know, where they're currently at and where do they need to move getting forward. And we know where that point is of like where they need to be productive. And I think that's like kind of a first point that I jotted down here was there's an underestimation that even a transition phase needs to happen. I think especially when you're in the midst of a long contest prep season, and it becomes a bit of normalcy to a degree. To where you think like, I feel pretty good, or you raise food on peak week. You're like, oh yeah, you know, I'm ready to hit it again. And you don't really realize how still suppressed in many areas that you are regarding recovery capacity or even injury profiles, things that you've been trying to work around. Even that basal fatigue level, even if you've dropped off a lot, you know, into peak week, that there's still, you're never going to be optimal being stage lean body fat. And even coming off like a show and the rigors of posing and things that go along with it. A friend of mine, as an example, you know, he was having some back issues posing and, you know, had the water reductions that took place and electrolyte imbalances. Just through that alone, put him into like rhabdo. Right. And so I've seen this happen so many times where people go and what do they train the next day after the show? Legs. Legs. And I've done it too. And thinking back, I was like, man, I was probably borderline had like rhabdo, I think, because I was so fatigued that next week. And even though I felt good, I thought I felt good leading into that session. So there's an underestimation there of like, hey, you really do need to move from the show into this post-show transition phase. And then we get to that point where we know we need to take the athlete from our assessment of like, where's that productive piece needs to be. And Luke, does that transition into probably what is the recovery capacity and the mistake number 2 here is just training beyond it, right? Because immediately your recovery bank is pretty low and you're having to pay back and recover just from all the rigors you put yourself through. So you just don't have the resources just yet to put all into a full-on training like you would peak off season or a specialization cycle like you would. So, I think that's a piece of what might that look like and what might be some generalizations that we could make to how you might shift into training to make sure you don't train beyond your recovery capacity.
Yeah. And look, like people are gung ho to progress heading into the post-show phase and they're ready to, especially if they lost, like progress what it is that kept them from winning. And I love the passion, and passionate athletes are why I coach in the first place. So it's never, something you take in a negative light, but there has to be some sort of objective plan of how we're going to get there. And the reason I always ask how the prep went is because this transition phase John's talking about can vary in duration a bit. And we talk about a lot of this in the post-show module of like cases where they're longer, where they're shorter, kind of what the normal expectation is. And that tells you how quick you're going to be able to start progressing this plan up in overall stimulus, right? And just kind of the general start points for most people is going to be around that total volume set that they had leading into peak week. Something I really like to do, especially that first week back, is have like an outline ready for them and let people tinker some with some movements they haven't had in play, have them training a couple reps in reserve, but explicitly stating that the volume can't be higher than the number of sets performed per session than what they were doing leading into peak week. And really this is just to kind of give them psychologically a little bit of a break, but it also keeps them within the stimulus range that they've been recovering from going into contest prep. And then that kind of starts the stage from there. And well, people then from there ask like, well, if we have to change a split design according to addressing a weak body part, then how do we manage that? And that's where like the coach expertise to me comes into play, because we look at total sets across the week that are performed. And if we're toggling up for one body part, that has to come from somewhere else. And it's just a skill that you develop over time. But I do think that when in doubt, we always start where we left off the prep. And that can be for 1 or 2 weeks for people that handled prep really well and have a short duration of recovery, to I've had people train at the same volume for 7-8 weeks because they're just that far dug into the hole when it came to their contest prep.
I think people might even underestimate like even the progress you might even be able to make at some point post show, even with a lowered volume level or less training in place. If you're actually recovering from that training, which is what you want, that you're actually creating those adaptations to improve. So, that good guideline is like what you're doing prior to peak week training wise and volume wise. That might be pretty close to what you're recovering from on prep. Now that's not always the case, right? We have people that are really digging and it's just kind of hanging in there, but bringing food up, that likely is a good starting point from, hey, a recoverable volume point where you could build from there. Now there's the other person, Luke, that you mentioned of like, hey, someone wants the psychological break, but others are like just obscenely obsessed, right? I'd be honest, this would be me. Like, I just want to go train. And so you're like, staying out of the gym is a problem. And I think that's the person you have to be very strategic with of how you're going to manage them. And I think you could train more, because a lot of times I'll just like, hey, let's look at what this initial split is. We'll just have some extra rest days in, but people like want to go train. So that could be a point of like, hey, we just like even strip back the volume farther and give them some guidelines as far as that goes. That way we're just managing fatigue. So some capacity there. And then I completely realize that people want to bring up body parts right away. And we just don't have the ability to do it, but likely, eventually you're going to see people's weak body parts always kind of stay as the weak body parts, which in turn will always kind of need this higher volume requirement. And the stronger body parts will kind of cater towards needing the lower amount. So like eventually you're going to get to some split where your specialized design is kind of like the one you're always on. Like my split always kind of looks like a specialization. It's just toggled up and down in volume a little bit for recovery. So moving post show, it doesn't really change much as far as like, oh man, I didn't realize my legs were weak. I need to bring them up now. Like, no, like I knew these things. So the design is kind of already similar in that capacity. So it might just be now shifting that volume back up once we get to the end of this transition period. And you brought up a good point too. Like, it varies so much. So I think like, well, how long? It's like 8 weeks. It's like, well, no, not necessarily. It's, as we're seeing this person, the recovery is high and training loads are progressing, and we're seeing, the subjective markers pull off from these prep adaptations. And that's when we might start making that transition up. For the enhanced side, it can be a little bit more murky there to a degree, because, during this time, well, at least what is not murky is the set amount of time that you need off. We're basically trying to look at your lifetime exposure as a PD user. And we know if we can build up as much time with low dosing as possible for a total lifetime exposure, that's probably less risk in the long run. So if you're like, I had a guy, he was talking to me about, hey man, lab markers are good. Can I just keep blasting post show? It's like, but he also ran the whole prep on high gear and the off season on high gear because his labs were okay. It's like, that doesn't mean you're not accruing like organ stress that hasn't come about. And we're also not just waiting till your lab markers go to shit too. So the post-show period is the ideal time to bring gear to its lowest and let nutrition drive the process from there. But in turn, we have to collaborate training in that means too. So the PD user, it's like, hey, if we can go 7-8 weeks with low gear, like training's going to be reflected. So it's a bit more of a set timeline. With the natural athlete, it varies so much based on how someone's, been removed from their body fat settling point. Seeing hormone derangement occur could take them longer or shorter to get back to that period. With the enhanced athletes, a little easier because we can kind of turn that knob up and down and control at least some of the hormone variables. But to give some range there, I mean, it's like usually from 4 to 8 weeks is a rough range of what you might see in some type of recovery period or transition period, where we move someone back into some specialized type of training. But that was a long bout just around training within your recovery capacity. So as a subjective feeling, you should keep feeling like you're getting farther away from how you feel on prep. If you feel like you're still on prep and you're like going into sessions and you feel that kind of brain fog present and you don't feel quite as motivated, or you're feeling like joints and aches since things are still not recovering, you're training beyond your recovery capacity. So just keep those things in mind as you're moving through. And one thing, Luke, I think we can transition to here is like taking the big hammer to drop fatigue. And I think many people kind of ignore the power of using deloads or even extra rest days. Like, how do you go about programming those, whether that's leading into peak week or post peak week? I mean, do you utilize these even often?
Yeah. So I like, training for me heading into peak week is always going to be deload in some nature. How extreme that deload is a product of how extreme that prep's has been. So like if someone's been coasting for a while and they're pretty good and fatigue's not very high, I might just do a slight reduction in the back end of the week. If they've been grinding to get there, that deload might start 6-7 days out. And so that's always happening peak week. I do have that slow reintroduction we kind of mapped out on the beginning of the post-show phase. For me, one thing I always like, and this is an anecdotal observation from doing this as many times as I've done it, is because you're in such of a fatigue deficit from the contest prep, I do think reaching the point for a deload happens a bit quicker for some athletes in the post-show phase, to the point where most end up needing some sort of deload before heading into the off-season push, especially for those who are in that 8 to 9 week post-show phase, 8, 9, 10 week post-show phase before heading into an off-season push. It's just building progressive training, even at lower volume exposures. And even though you're progressing subjectively how you feel, I do tend to see it fall off the cliff pretty quickly, where it's pretty much standard for, I'd say, a large percentage of athletes where there's some sort of deload dynamic that has to happen heading into the off-season phase. And the reason I do that is because the goal is to keep that off-season push where we have super physiological PED exposure as progressive as possible for as long as possible. Because people forget, and God love this industry, but training is the core stimulus for hypertrophy. If we want to maximize hypertrophy, we want to maximize our ability to drive that stimulus to the athlete. And so I'm doing anything that I can to make sure that I can give that progressive stimulus for as long a period of time as the health metrics let me, the body fat percentage lets me, and how well they can manage that stimulus for a period of time. Now, if they go too long for a deload, that means I can pull the volume set up. If they go really short, that means I can pull the volume set down. And then I just toggle it based on the subjective metrics. And I have a sheet where they go through and map out their subjective metrics, but deloads have to happen. I think it's very underutilized. And I think, honestly, the most valuable place for me is extending the training piece throughout that off-season phase for maximal productivity with that first push, after the post show.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the offseason? Upgrade your coaching game with J3U University. Our program covers everything from offseason to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our forums with our J3U team to answer any questions you have and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3U University. Let's get back to today's podcast. Yeah. I think many people want to skip out on the deloads, or there's some segments that are just doing too many pre-planned as well. So there's just a balance within it. I think just if you want to safeguard yourself, yes, you should kind of be tapering into your show with lowering volume and effort levels. And so when you do get to show, you should be relatively fresh. I was kind of scrolling around for this paper that I came across. It was a quasi-experimental study on the energy expenditure, exercise intensity, and rating, perceived exertion of male bodybuilding posing training. I don't know if you saw this, but
no, I did not.
Yeah, posing counted as vigorous cardio. So moderate to high intensity cardio for health benefits and energy expenditure. And posing sessions absolutely would eat into your recovery capacity. So it's maybe something that's not getting considered. Like you have, that's my training volume, resistance training. I have my cardio, and then I pose a little bit. It's like, all this counts into your total exercise volume that's going to drive fatigue. So yes, you tapered down training into your show, but man, if you got worked on stage, just tell me, most people, if you got worked on stage, you feel kind of like a wreck the next day. And I've been worked on stage and I don't want to go train the next day. You realize you accumulate a ton of fatigue in something like a show situation, not only from the physical capacity, but also the mental side as well. Being worked psychologically, amped up, the highs and lows of the excitement or the sadness of not doing how you wanted to. So it's a lot. It's taxing. So even though you had some form of deload into your show, you still very likely will accrue a ton of fatigue during your posing on stage. So that's why usually the next day after the show, I say take it completely off and let's get hydration, everything back to a normal level. Even if that means a secondary day off as well, we can see that to be completely reasonable. So we at least strip off some initial fatigue from what we did around the show. And then we start up our training from there, which is likely at that point a restart of our pre-peak week level volume. But I usually tell people, hey, keep just a couple reps in the tank, man, if you can. But if I know someone's crazy, then I'm like, yeah, okay, let's just do one set here, and because I know they're not gonna listen. So, but I think managing those initial days is huge for not taking away a week or two extra from what someone needs to get back to productive training. Now, you likely could strip back training pretty far in that transition period. I've had some guys who were training 5 days a week. We go down 4 days per week, doing upper lower splits, and it's very recoverable. But one thing you have to keep in mind is that even then it still accumulates like connective tissue stuff because guys are getting strong pretty quick. So that's why, Luke brings up on the back end before entering into a pushing phase, it still makes a lot of sense, and it's not going to take away all the gains from just taking an extra few days to just heal up a bit before going into your next phase. So easily an area that's probably underutilized by some, maybe overutilized by others. And I think that gets into like, we're bringing up injuries and things is like setting up to your training to where you're not actually addressing the prep injuries that were occurring the whole time, because we're stubborn and we like to train. And so like I right now, like it's like almost nonstop something feeling like a little is off. Like it's rarities now where something doesn't hurt to some degree, and that's probably not normal, but maybe it is at the higher level. I always quote Dave Tate on Elite FTS. He's a powerlifter. He's said if something's not always hurt or broken, then you're not training hard enough. And I've said it on here before. I'm like, that's not probably the best advice. We don't seek that out, but when you're pushing yourself at that higher end of the level, it almost feels that way. Like right now I have some type of bicep tendonitis going on, and it's probably not going to fully recover because I have to keep training in prep. But if I keep training the same way post show, it's never going to get better. I'll have more resources to recover, but I will start training beyond my recovery capacity. How am I going to heal up this connective tissue issue that's there? So I do have to arrange training in a way to allow these areas that have been accruing connective tissue damage on prep to heal. So that's some consideration points. And I think we just get stubborn and we don't want to lose progress or what we want to bring to the next show by just being stubborn and keeping the same training program in place.
Yeah, I think this could be potentially one of the biggest values of post show is like hitting the reset button, because not only are people stubborn on a injury profile perspective, like just finding ways to train around it or training through it. I do think execution for people who are a little bit more logbook oriented does tend to slide as much as you don't like to admit that it probably does. And I think it happens a lot, especially within like the fiery, more passionate individuals from a psychological perspective, because they're putting their all into it. And, a lot of those people have put a lot of energy into their training performance. And, you can kind of see it on like a lot of the compound patterns. Like the classic one I'll see is like hinging. Like hinging will go from this like really well executed hinge, it's all glued hamstring, to we start to get a little bit of lumbar, then we start to get a little bit of a pelvic tucks to try to get this load up. And then it just kind of slowly progresses into this like pseudo deadlift RDL that you've just managed to hang on by a string, right? And I think when we look at injury profiles, like it comes from places that are either we're exposing tissues to load that it can't tolerate at end ranges, or we're taking it into places that aren't appropriate for whatever pattern we're performing. And I think that most likely happens in prep, where we don't have the cognitive capacity to be aware of it as much as we do in the off season. And you're kind of holding on for dear life. And that's where post show, I think, even just relearning patterns is a huge step in the right direction to managing injury profiles, of really breaking it down in those first 1, 2, 3 weeks, really setting some high standards of execution, and then progressing off of that standard of execution. A lot of times we'll handle a lot of niggles for people that they've had through the prep. Now, more serious injury profiles, we're probably looking at like potentially bringing in a practitioner to help with some like outside gym therapy. We're looking at, is there a mobility issue that's driving this? We're looking at movement swaps in order to keep them from loading that tissue in a way that's going to continue that injury. But I would say, man, like, and I don't know if you see this, but 90% of the problems people see in prep are largely related to kind of the first two problems I see, of either loading tissues at end ranges they can't handle, or changing execution to a point that puts them in compromised positions most of the time.
Oh man, you hit so many points that we could just go on.
I'm trying to condense it all down, right? But there's so much. Like,
no, it's so training. It's so true, and probably why I have like bicep tendonitis going on. It's that you start shifting your form around a bit, and you're loading more of the the passive tissues in those movements, how they shouldn't be loaded, and that just accrues. And yeah, you're meeting numbers, but in reality, you're shifting form to do so, which you could have had a more accurate look at your logbook and realized, okay, I'm not able to recover right now, and I should make some training adjustments based around that, versus like, no, I'm still good. Like I'm holding muscle and I'm just, matching the logbook. So yeah, those form that aspect. Potentially there was the wrong exercises already chosen. And once you drop off your recovery capacity a bit in prep, then it just further exposed that you can't recover connective tissue wise. So I think it's great post-show is you first things you're addressing the form, the right exercise choices that don't cause pain, and let those be standardized. One thing I've done, and I am, I come from a background of being very logbook oriented, so it's like a constant on and off struggle. But there's also times where I'm like, you know what, I'm going to do my sets and I'm going to jot them down. I'm not going to look at what I did before. My main intention here is just executing how I feel like perceived I did the last time, with the focus on the intended muscle, just like I want. And the number will be what the number is. I know how to train hard. That's not going to be my limiting factor in this, right? Like, oh man, you just didn't train hard enough. Like, that's why you didn't hit your numbers. Like, no, that won't be it. If anything, if I know the number, Luke, when you're in that set, the number, you're going to force the number to happen. So what if you just don't look at the logbook and you just train and you write down your numbers, and then you can truly watch the trend of how that moves. And organically, hopefully, post-show, it's going to move up. So post-show could almost be a time where, hey, jot down the workouts, look back as an assessment point. Don't look as your logbook as where you need to smash it today and destroy it. Let it organically happen, and let your focus be on execution and form, because actually that is what bodybuilding is. And really, that probably is how we all should be training, rather than like a powerlifter of like, these are the numbers that were hit last time. These are the numbers that need to be hit today. We're not chasing numbers. We're chasing around stimulus for the muscle. So how do you do that in your training? Well, you focus on stimulus of the muscle. So I think that might be a shift that could help a lot of people. Psychologically, it could be probably beneficial. How do you feel about that? Could you handle that, Luke, not looking at your logbook numbers before you do your lift?
I think it's experiential based. So like, I think that works really well for the athlete who's been doing it a long time and has a high level of experience with logbook progressions. And the only reason I say this is because I have a few athletes in the post-show phase who haven't been the greatest about logbooking, and they're now just learning logbooking in the post-show phase. And going through the details of looking at it each week and learning how to actually make progressions is like a big learning piece for them to then make that next step, I think. So there's a large percentage of the people that we talk to here that I think that's beautiful for, perfect for, right? Like someone like you, John, or someone like Darren, or someone that's in that upper level of exposure. The training execution and the training effort's going to be there. You've done logbooking in the past, so you know how to work progressions up like almost intuitively. And so then you can kind of be a little bit more reflective on it, where people that are still learning it, there's a lot of value in kind of learning that skill. Like this is a learned skill, just like anything is. And so I would tend to agree for a large percentage, but I do think just because there's going to be a percentage of the audience that's still in this place with their still learning what accurate logbook progressions look like, not being too aggressive or not being too mild. And I think most people are on the too aggressive side because of egos, but that's kind of where I think learning that skill is a prerequisite to doing that. But I think at the end of the day, that's going to be the best way to do it post-show for sure. Yeah, no, it was just more of a challenge thought piece that I brought up, because I still think you need to be able to look at the logbook, because I wouldn't remember what I did otherwise. Yeah. It's like, what did I even have on this machine? I don't know. People that say that remember they're full of shit. I know that, because there's no way. But yeah, anyway, I think you need the emotional maturity and knowing that, okay, this is what I did last time. It gives me a place to probably load and start at, and then you execute how you need to, and then it is what it is.
and try to have to disconnect the emotions around if the numbers don't only move up, that means I'm doing bad. And that's not what that means. And so I think at this level, it's not necessarily the skill set of needing to not look at your logbook and just focus on the execution, but being able to consider the logbook, focus on execution, and do what you need to drive that stimulus without letting the logbook just influence you to just chase the number down. I think that's the development side when you get more intermediate to the advanced level. Completely agree on your point all around being someone newer to this, is that they need to ensure that they also are accumulating load reps to keep up with the adaptive stimulus. And some people are on that spectrum where they do need to get pushed harder, but there's also the balance for them too of, making sure that over time they're learning about focusing stimulus, and what muscle groups they're training, and having that to a degree take place. I think in our crowd where we pull a lot of people through, they're beyond that kind of beginner stage.
Yeah, absolutely.
But for the majority of like who we speak to, it's trying to disconnect from the logbook of what it is thought to be made of, like, you got to beat your numbers, to more of it's a diagnostic tool, and keeping the emotional disconnect from it.
Yeah. And I think that brings to cardio filling up the cup a bit too much for some people, don't you think?
Yeah, it was kind of a final point to jot down that, and I've not to pick on you ladies, but I feel like it might, be on the ladies' side of the equation. And guy side, to be fair, it could be some guys too, but I say this towards ladies because typically a lot of female classes have to get very high in cardio. And I've started lowering cardio, and people are fearful of lowering cardio, just like being fearful of raising food because they're worried about the weight gain to ensue from that. And, there should be a tapering that takes place of cardio, but remember what I just said earlier about your total exercise volume. It's like reducing that cardio level. We're now able to fill in more resources for the training piece. And, as far as the gaining goes, like, it needs to happen in this phase to get you to a point where we're all trying to head to be, take off from the off season and really potentiate it. So if you're trying to do a lot of cardio to keep down, your energy balance towards maintenance, you're just not doing what you need to move forward in a productive off-season phase. And you very likely, especially in the female divisions, that's a high priority in training legs on top of you're doing cardio that is also has some leg involvement, that you very well be very limiting yourself for making progress. So we do want to get cardio transition back down to a baseline. I don't see this as problematic for the guy side, maybe more so like limiting food to try to stay lean the whole time. Most people are okay with, usually the issue is too rapid of fat gain, and then maybe in turn trying to compensate with keeping cardio up. So, but that's still, it's just trying to fix a bad issue with another, bad issue. That's gets in a pretty poor protocols that way. So, overdoing cardio, it's just removing you from your recovery ability and what you're trying to do actually in the off season.
Yeah, I would agree. You're going to get me on a soapbox if we go down nutrition progression for guys. So I'm going to relay that and save that for another podcast. But I think it's kind of a nail on the head. Like, it's a tool to use to manage where the athlete's at in the direction they're headed. And to me, if we talk about the ideal, right? So not looking at people struggling with the food side, the ideal is to get this activity down as fast as possible so that it's not a metric that's interfering with the training performance side. Then we can use food as a tool to push up from there. But that's all I will say on that soapbox.
Yeah. That's good. And I think a last consideration point, just addressing the total exercise volume, is the posing piece. Because you've been practicing posing nonstop leading the show, and most people are just like, I am completely done with this.
Gotta bring it down.
Like forget it. Like I am done. And then you gain size and you kind of lose some access. And then all of a sudden you're not hitting your side try and your check-in picks because you just simply can't do it anymore. So I think it's like making sure of like when you looked on stage and leading in the show, like what were your limitations in your posing, and that those are also still carried into your post-show phase to address in your training to improve your posing. However, use it or lose it. And if you stop your posing, you're going to lose some of the capacity of your ability to do it. Because I know, like, as I'm increasing posing into the show, like I'm able to get into my poses easier and easier. And yeah, it's a body weight thing too, but also it's a practice thing. So making sure you're able just to keep those posing adaptations present is important. It should scale back for sure in the off season, but I think you still need to have some sessions in place and don't let it fully drop off. But I'll leave it at that. And I think we can wrap up there, Luke. Don't make these post-show training mistakes. Let this be a positive transition phase to where you can end this phase and then move streamline into an off season, and you'll just be constant, nonstop linear progression all off season. Not fully linear, but it'll be much more productive than winding up post-show, still beat up, not recovered, and then having to take more time to even do so. But anyway, we'll have our new post-show module updated for everyone in J3 University Level 1. So that's going to be, has a lot of great training pieces in there. So check that out. Leave any comments, questions below, and we will talk to you next time.